We're going to look at some of God's Word together. We're going to turn our attention to one of the Psalms, and Psalm 139. Psalm 139. Psalm 139 then. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in, behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you would slay the wicked, O God. Away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This is a magnificent psalm. This is a magnificent psalm. It's titled for the director of music, a psalm of David. David was referred to in 2 Samuel as the sweet psalmist of Israel. And this is such a wonderful piece of writing. The chief musician, there's no real consensus as to who that is. Some think of it, the chief musician as being the Lord God himself. Therefore, it's a psalm dedicated to the Lord in that sense. But others think that it might have been one of the choir leaders of the Old Testament, Heman or Asaph, who are both mentioned in the book of Chronicles, that they could be the one to whom this psalm is directed for singing, for arrangement, if you like. There was a French priest in the 1600s called Claude Fleury, and he wrote about this. And I think he was, from what he wrote, he was addressing clearly the people of his day. And he referred to the people of the day as modern wits. He said, let the modern wits after this look upon the honest shepherd of Palestine as a company of rude and unpolished clowns. How dare they, he says, in other words, look at such writing and criticize it. He goes on to say, let these modern wits, if they can, produce something better, something more sublime, more delicate, or better tuned. He speaks of the divinity and the piety which is found in the expressions that the psalmist uses. And my focus today, and perhaps for a very obvious reason, is verse 14. We'll look at some of the other verses that surround it, but primarily we're looking at verse 14 today. I praise you, the psalmist says, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. What does that mean for us today? In the context of bringing a child before God and thanking God for that child. What does it mean to be fearfully and wonderfully made? Well, the context of the psalm is the incredible nature of our physical bodies. The human body is complex. It's unique. It has a complexity and a uniqueness that speaks volumes of the mind of the Creator. Every aspect of the body, down to the tiniest microscopic cell, reveals that it is fearfully and wonderfully made. If you ever stop to consider this complexity, I'm sure, like many, you will marvel at it. Now, of course, we this morning look at ourselves and perhaps we've had a glance in the mirror and we think, really? Fearfully, wonderfully made? But that is what we are. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a structural engineer. He's been called out of retirement to help deal with something of the crisis in the local authority. He worked for the local authority, and he's been called out of retirement to help examine some of the buildings that are present to do with this whole sort of controversy around concrete and stuff. And I remember a conversation that I had with him years ago, and he was explaining to me how when he's designing a building from a structural point of view, not the aesthetics, but from the structural point of view, he was describing to me the supporting beams that they put together. And he says they always put the strong material towards the outside edges of a cross-section, and they fill the inside with the lighter, weaker material, because he says all the stresses occur, all the bending occurs towards the outer part of that beam. And he was describing that to me, and we were sitting there, both of us as Christians, and then he said to me, he said, do you know, have you ever seen the cross-section of a human bone? He said, the cross-section of a human bone, he said, reveals the strong material is on the outside, and the inside is a kind of a factory for the blood cells of various kinds, but he says the strong part is on the outside. It's almost as if structural engineers have looked at what God has made and said, you know what, we can replicate that and make something strong. When you examine, if I were to take out my phone and turn the camera on here this morning and focus it on you guys. If I were to do that this morning, immediately, I'm not going to take a photograph of you, so don't worry. But immediately, as I look at this and as I move it around, this camera is compensating for the change of light. This camera's focus is constantly going in and out to find the best picture of you. I don't have to do any work with that. It's almost as if the designer of that camera looked at the human eye and thought, we can replicate that. We can take that human eye, because it's got a vast range of field, and we can look at that, and we can replicate that. We've got two eyeballs. We have depth perception. It gives us the ability to judge how far something is away from us. The human brain is an amazing organ. It is fearfully and wonderfully made. It has the ability to learn. It has the ability to reason. It has the ability to control so many automatic functions of the body, such as heart rate and blood pressure and breathing. It has the ability to maintain balance so that I can stand on one leg and still talk to you. I can lift up a Bible. Oh, I got cramp. Ooh. I should not stand on one leg. But I can do different tasks here this morning. I can lift a Bible above my head and still talk to you. I can do different things. You can do different things, and you don't have to think about many of those things. So wonderful is this brain that we have. We can run, we can stand, we can sit, and we can concentrate on doing something else at the same time. Now, of course, science is a wonderful thing, and science will explain a lot of these things to us. But don't let that take away from the fact that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. In an experiment conducted a few years ago, they did two things. They put glasses on people that made them perceive the world as upside down. And they let them live with those glasses for a little while. And what they discovered was that the brain compensated so that they were now looking at the world the right side up. They had other people blindfolded for long periods of time. And what they discovered was that the vision center of the brain began to be used for other functions. When people moved, the house that I used to live in Bridgend, was very close to the M4 motorway. And people would come and visit, and we'd perhaps sit in the garden in the summer and have a barbecue or whatever. And they'd say, "Doesn't that noise bother you?" And we'd say, "What noise?" What noise? Because somehow the brain has compensated for that and allowed me not to be disturbed by the noise. I'd lost consciousness, if you like, with regards to that. This is fearfully and wonderfully made. You, that little baby this morning, are fearfully and wonderfully made. The single fertilized cell of a newly conceived human life. From that one cell within the womb develops all the different kinds of tissues and organs and systems, all working together at just the right time in an amazingly coordinated process. But I know, and you know, by experience, that sometimes things go wrong, that sometimes things break down. We get that, we understand that. What we're talking about here is the gold standard as far as God is concerned. That prior to the fall, everything, as he describes it as fearfully, wonderfully made, it was perfect. But despite the fact that you and I sometimes break down and sometimes things go wrong and things happen, nevertheless, that doesn't take away from the fact of how God views us. How the psalmist sees himself as fearfully and wonderfully made. And this fearfully and wonderfully made thing has the ability to know the Creator. Our Creator through his Son, Jesus Christ. We have the ability to know our Creator. And this psalm, and the writer of this psalm, David, it's been described as the summit of Old Testament poetry. It's personal, it's deeply felt, it's an expression of what the psalmist knows of God, of how God knows him, of how God surrounds him, of how God made him. It's a psalm about you and me, about how God made and knows and surrounds each one of us. You have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. As we journey through the psalm towards this verse 14, where the psalmist describes us as being fearfully and wonderfully made, before that he describes how God is with us. In the first four verses of the psalm, he sets out God's amazing, detailed knowledge of him. He says, God knows me completely. He knows whether I sit or whether I rise, whether I travel, whether I settle, whatever I do. He knows me completely. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that God knows you completely? You see, there are two responses, I think. One is to feel threatened, or the other is to feel comforted. We can feel threatened when we feel like we've got something to hide, when we feel broken, when we feel shame, when we feel guilt. We think, I don't want God to know that about me. But when we take steps towards God and turning away from sin, and his knowledge of us becomes a comfort, actually. It can be very uncomfortable to know that you're always being watched. You know, we see this, don't we, in occasional news items where we hear that, you know, the local authorities are using cameras, supermarkets are using AI technology and facial recognition technology. Now, some supermarkets are trialing this to stop certain people coming into the supermarkets. Don't know how you feel about that. That might feel you leaving a little bit uncomfortable. Because we always feel uncomfortable when we feel like we're being watched. But a child, a little child, did you notice? You know, it fits so perfectly in with, you know, Lilibeth became my sermon illustration this morning. Because did you notice, as I was walking around the church, where were her eyes? Her eyes were back here all the time as to where are my parents? Because you see, we feel comfortable when we're being watched by somebody who loves us. As her parents followed her around the church, as her eyes were on her parents, looking, where are they? Because she is comforted, even at such a young age, by the presence of her parents watching over her. So much so that she could come into the arms of a complete stranger and walk around this building. You see, it is one thing to be afraid of the knowledge of God. And I hope that none of us are that. But to be comforted because we have a loving parent who watches over us. There was a poet by the name of Francis Thompson. Francis Thompson was homeless. He wrote a number of brilliant poems, but one of the poems he wrote was The Hound of Heaven. And in the poem, Francis Thompson describes how he tried to run away from God. He speaks about this and says, I fled from him down the nights and down the days. I fled from him down the arches of the years. I fled from him down the labyrinth of time. I fled from him. I hid from him. When I then discovered, he says, I turned and I faced him. And I realized that the darkness, the shadows over me, it was his outstretched hand covering me. God knows us. God surrounds us. Where can I flee from your presence, the psalmist asks, as if that is a possibility anyway. The psalmist speaks about fleeing. If I go up to the heavens, you're there. He says, if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Some people have thought of this and have written about this and says that the psalmist is speaking of heaven and hell, but he's not. The psalmist is speaking about his experience with God on this earth, that if he goes to the very furthest reaches of this world, he'll not be able to escape the presence of God. You can go to the furthest east or the furthest west. It'll be in vain. And perhaps the scariest thing of all for those who fear God is that a God who pursues you to the ends of the earth is one thing. But a God who's already there when you've arrived is something else entirely. The whole approach of this psalm is that the psalmist wants to, it appears initially, to get away from God. He's like Jonah in the Old Testament, who was told by God to go one place, but in opposition to God went in completely the opposite direction. And that ended not too well, if we know the story. But the psalmist, having discovered that God is present wherever he is, learns to appreciate that. When he writes, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as a light to you. The ever-present Lord can even make the night shine like day. And that's comforting. That even in the darkest moments of our life, God can bring light. Why? Because God has made me. God has made you fearfully and wonderfully. He is the already God. I cannot speak without him knowing it already. I cannot go anywhere without his being there already. And I cannot, even by what I am without God, I am nothing without God, but having been made by God, constructed by God, in my mother's womb, the psalmist says. The womb that he speaks about here, the secret place. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. As one person wrote about this, said, if ever there was a time when I was concealed in darkness out of your divine line of sight, then surely, God, it was during that antenatal period. My own mother wasn't aware of my existence for a while. It was as if I was buried in some deep cave under the earth, and it was precisely then that I was most conspicuously the recipient of your care and attention. I was being woven together, intricately wrought, the RSV says, by a God who on that tiny scale was engaged in a task perhaps more like his original immense work of creation than anything else that he does. He was creating. And he was creating not only life, but a life. Your eyes, the psalmist says, saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Not just from birth to death, but from conception to death. A human life, God's handiwork. Psalm 139, I think, is a resounding no. However difficult it might be to hear, and however difficult it might be to practice, Psalm 139 is a resounding no to those who, for reasons of their own, would cut life off by abortion at one end or by euthanasia at the other. Psalm 139 is God's way of saying, hands off the lives that have been created. But again, we're talking about a gold standard here. Because I don't judge. I recognize that these things happen in our world. I don't judge. I show love to people. I don't want to judge people. But there is a standard that God has. And it's from conception through to death. And it's hands off. Because God has created. And all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And when we come to verse 17, we realize not only are we fearfully and wonderfully made, not only are we created by God, not only that he knows everything there is to know about us, but we come to verse 17 and 18 and we realize that God thinks about us, that God thinks about you. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I'm still with you. Not just from birth to death, not just created, but you are thought about by God. From the very youngest to the very oldest here this morning, God has countless thoughts about you. The details of those thoughts are his. I imagine he's thinking about your body. I imagine he's thinking about your mind, your psychology, your emotions, your circumstances, your pain, your relationships, your joys. God is thinking about you. To quote another churchman and poet, John Keble, new every morning is the love our awakening and uprising prove. New every morning. The psalmist says, when I awake, I am still with you. I am with you, a God who thinks about me. The psalmist wakes up with that realization. You know, we all go through life, and there are times when we think, you know what, in life, I just would like to know who I am. We sometimes, in those sober moments, ask that question, who am I? Some of us over the years, perhaps in various work-life situations, have done personality tests. And we've come out as lions or beavers or activators or competitors or introverts. And as helpful as some things like that can be, what does God think about you? How does God view you? Who does God say that I am? Here's what I think to that, the answer to that question is, you are valuable. God says, I am the creator and you are my creation. I breathed into your nostrils the breath of life. I created you in my image. My eyes saw your unformed substance. I knit you together in your mother's womb. I know the number of hairs on your head, and before a word is on your tongue, I know it. You are fearfully and you are wonderfully made. You are the pinnacle of God's creation. From baby Lilibeth through to the oldest one of us here, we are the pinnacle of God's creation. And I know that it doesn't always feel like that. And I know that we struggle. And I know that sometimes it's hard. But it's not just that God knows everything. He knows you. It's not just that God is everywhere. He is everywhere with you. It's not just that God created everything. He created